Kia ora everyone. Kia ora e te Typism whanau. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, which means in Māori, hello Typism family, greetings to you all. I guess in Aussie it probably just means g'day. I don't know, no one's actually said that to me yet, so maybe I'm in the wrong state. Oh, I need my thing. There we go. So I'm the other Kate, and I hail from across the ditch, the land of the long white cloud, best country in the world, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I just want to take a minute to acknowledge and give thanks to the first peoples of Aotearoa, the tangata whenua, who have done so much to look after our islands and the language that's inspired me in my work. So, always a bit controversial telling a room of Aussies that New Zealand's the best country in the world, but it is. I hope you'll get to come and visit it one day. I know Dominique loves it, she comes all the time. So there's saying that. And I know there's at least a couple of us, but hands up if there are any other Kiwis in the room. Yeah. Yes. Oh, there's lots of us. Yay. Let's hang out afterwards. Yeah, cool. Strength in numbers. Rivalries aside, thanks so much to Dominique and the Typism community for having me here. It's such an awesome lineup of speakers. It's actually quite unnerving to be here, to be honest. And Kate and Larry just hit it out of the park this morning. But there's two Kates, so that's always going to be a great day, no matter what, so in my mind. So when Dominique got in touch last year about talking at Typism, I was kind of well, yes, that's something you say yes to, but at the same time I said to her, I'm look, I'm pregnant, and I'm going to have a baby by then, and I also won't be very active work-wise in early 2019, so I'm not totally sure it's a good idea. But she said that was no problem, because Carla Hackett had brought her baby along last year and that she'd started a whole new trend and that these future little letterers were always welcome at Typism. So the whole process of being invited and getting here has been super encouraging for me, becoming a new mum. It has been a really, really interesting time in my life putting this talk together. My whole perspective has shifted since a tiny human has arrived in our lives. Everyone says that it does, but I don't think you get it until it happens to you. And also baby brain is a very real thing, which at times has left me questioning whether I could pull this talk off. So the title of my talk, Shifting Perspectives, it stems from this, and that while I was reflecting on my life and career, it became quite clear that it's been shaped by a series of key events, which at the time, they caused a shift in my perspective and sort of led me in a totally different direction. So I'm just going to talk a bit about that today. So, fun fact, in a former life I was actually an architect, and that life seems so far away from the life I have now. It's kind of funny to reflect on how that actually happened and how I ended up here. Going back to high school, I spent my life in the art department. I loved it so much. I was so happy just to spend my lunchtimes inside painting and drawing. So it kind of makes no sense to me looking back now as to why school careers counsellors told me I should pursue architecture. I was just so obviously not meant to be an architect, and I'll never really understand who tells an art-obsessed student that they should go and do architecture instead of going to art school. But being a fine artist was strongly discouraged due to lack of career opportunities. I got the whole an arts degree won't make you any money spiel numerous times. And no one ever said I could make a career as an illustrator. It just wasn't even something that was mentioned. So I ended up doing calculus in my final year because it was required to be an architect. And I failed miserably. I remember sitting in that exam and I was actually counting through the number of points that I knew that I'd missed out on. So I knew I'd failed in the exam. And I also soon discovered that you don't need calculus because that's literally what engineers are for. So I spent 5 years at architecture school. I wanted to leave in year 2, but I kind of felt I had no way out. I felt very much that the general feeling amongst family and friends and where I grew up was very much you went to university and you stuck to your path. And architecture school, it was quite creative and at times it was experimental, but it wasn't all ground in reality. So I spent a lot of time working on my presentations. I really loved making them look good. I had no interest in whether or not my design could stand up structurally. So I think from the get-go, it was quite clear that I was never going to be an architect. And then after 5 years of hard work, my class graduated straight into the 2008 global financial crisis. So no one in the careers department or any of the tutors at uni gave us any heads up that when the world's economy crashes, the construction industry is the first thing to go bottoms up. So like no one wants architects when they don't have any money. So even after with a degree, I still wasn't making any money. So I hopped across the bigger ditch of the Pacific Ocean, and I rode out the recession snowboarding in Canada, and it was really, really fun. I was there for a year, and this is the best office view I've had to date. But the feeling I should do something with my degree kind of never left me, and I actually ended up moving to Melbourne. I worked there as an architect for 3 years, and I hated it so much. Like, I barely picked up a pencil. I spent a huge amount of time talking about toilets, electrical wiring, and plumbing, and air conditioning, because it's Australia and it's hot as hell. And the whole time I was just wishing I was back in Canada or basically anywhere else. And it was nothing like architecture school, and it was every bit the reality of being an architect. So for a very long time, I'd had this feeling that I should be pursuing architecture because I'd had the degree and it would be a waste if I didn't use it. But at some point in those 3 years, I started kind of picking up little short courses and things that were available on the weekend, and I did an illustration one. And I just fell in love with drawing again. So I started using pens and pencils. I was drawing in my spare time. And I really loved it, just like I had in high school. And I started wondering, like, if I loved this so much, why couldn't I do that every day instead of what I was doing? So my perspective on what I should be doing changed to what I could be doing. And that looked like a much more endurable path to me. So in my late 20s, I took what I like to call early retirement. And I left my full-time salary-paying job as an architect and went to design school. So to this day, going to design school, best decision I've ever made. I was getting to draw every day. I was finally like learning things that actually interest me. I actually only had one typography paper. It was all computer-based, and we were mainly just looking at different typefaces and their various characteristics. But it was my tutor at the time, Simon Ashford, and he said, if you're interested in type and lettering, you might want to go back to the roots of it all and study calligraphy. And so on the side, I started looking a bit more into calligraphy because I hadn't actually thought of it as something you did for a very long time. Like the last time I could remember using calligraphy pens was in primary school. And I also did a couple of hand lettering workshops that were starting to pop up around Melbourne. At this time, I didn't use social media for my work. I didn't have Instagram. Facebook was purely for personal use. And I did a workshop with Bobby Heikalsha at Bobster 14. His last name's really hard to pronounce, so hopefully I did it some justice. The piece on the right was one of the first lettering pieces I ever did at his workshop, and like full credit goes to him for encouraging me to get on Instagram and start sharing my work. Because he said something to me like, no one is going to come and find you drawing in your bedroom. And it resonated with me, and I truly believe this now. I really think sometimes as designers and artists, the whole marketing and advertising ourselves doesn't come naturally. Like I know it doesn't for me. I really hate the whole salesy, pushy, look at my work, look at what I'm selling. But Instagram, it was a really different platform to the algorithm-based beast it is today. But at the beginning, it was so important for me in terms of getting my work out in front of people. I feel like I have a bit more of a love-hate relationship with it these days, but yeah. So after finishing a 1-year diploma at design school, I actually said goodbye to Australia and I moved back home to New Zealand. And I got a job working in a marketing company in the creative team doing graphic design. And so I worked on a lot of corporate design projects and I spent a lot of time on the computer. And during this time, I started to get the feeling that I'd had while I was studying architecture, that the job I was in just wasn't quite what I should be doing. On the side, I was learning calligraphy at night school. I was taking on small graphic design freelance jobs, and I was just practicing my calligraphy and lettering whenever I could. So it was very much a hobby at this stage. Lots of practice sheets, lots of repetition, but I just started posting this on Instagram. I also joined the New Zealand calligraphers. So these are this super lovely group of people. They've got some seriously good calligraphy skills, but when I joined, I was like the youngest person by like 30 years. And in the last couple of years, a few other young people have joined, which is really, really cool, but the general vibe's still really old school. It's like, a classic cup of tea and biscuit at the monthly meeting, some deviled eggs and asparagus rolls will be thrown in the mix if it's a special occasion. But they're so talented and they just have all this knowledge and they're so willing to share the knowledge and they're so excited that young people are joining that like kind of being a part of them, I've just kind of stuck with them over the last 4 or so years. So in 2014, I left my corporate design job and I went on this dream trip to Italy I'd always wanted to go there since studying art history in high school. And this trip is probably the second best career decision I ever made. So just before I left, I discovered that there was a week-long calligraphy course being run by an Italian calligrapher called Monica Dengo. It was taking place in her home studio in Arezzo in Tuscany. So I emailed her on the off chance that there might still be space available, and it was a bit like fate. There was one spot left, and it was mine if I wanted it. And so this whole trip kind of became like my version of the book Eat, Pray, Love. I ate pastries and I did calligraphy in like this Renaissance era studio with frescoes on the ceiling, and I saw manuscripts that were 1,000 years old, and I made all sorts of connections, and I met my Portuguese soul sister, Marta. She's like the Portuguese version of me, so it was so dreamy. And this workshop with Monica, it was nothing like the formal calligraphy that I've been learning. It was expressive, it was free, at times it was totally abstract. It was my first time experimenting with ruling pens and making my own tools. And this whole workshop just ignited this love for contemporary calligraphy. Like, I was obsessed with it. I was so interested in mark making and exploring how you can make patterns and textures from words and language. I really loved that you could take the formal rules of calligraphy and then push all the boundaries and break all the rules. It didn't matter so much if there were imperfections, because it was often those imperfections that made the compositions look more interesting. And at the end of this workshop, we bound all the pieces we'd created into books. And this is something that I've continued to do after other workshops that I've done. And the books become like really great reference points, and they also sometimes become like little works of art in themselves. And I also think it's really important to hang on to the work, like your early work and all the practice work you do, so you can kind of like look back on it and check in on it, and you can kind of actually see that you've made a progression over the years. So I've attended several workshops over the years, and last year Marta and I even met up in Japan to do another workshop with Monica. This time she'd teamed up with a Japanese calligrapher called Satsuki Hatsushima, and I think Charlene's here today and she was also at that workshop. So again, just making connections with people from all over the world. And so I just can't encourage you enough to never stop learning. So learn as much as you can from anyone who interests you. So these are all people whose workshops I've done over the years. There's heaps available online, but I just really think learning in person is like the most invaluable experience. And the workshops I've attended, particularly the international ones, have just been the best experiences for me. Like, every time I go, I'm just like completely reinvigorated. I do find it amusing at times that after 6 years of university education, everything I learned about calligraphy and lettering is from workshops and the internet and not actually from going to uni. But go figure. So anyway, after working in this beautiful 14th century Renaissance studio for a week, my whole perspective on what working life was like had changed. Like, I decided there was no way I could go back to working in an office 9 to 5 in front of a computer. I wanted a studio, I wanted to do calligraphy, and I wanted to create art. So I decided life's too short. I took the leap and became a freelance designer, illustrator, and calligrapher. And I really leaped. Like, I didn't make any plans. I was just like, I work for myself now. Much to my dad's dismay, who continues to ask if I have a business plan. Well, would I recommend this as the best way to do it? I am not sure. I do think having a stack of cash behind you and a business plan is probably a good thing, but I think I've made it work just because I keep pushing forward, thinking I'm not going back. The first year I went out on my own, I had a yes year, where I said yes to anything and everything that came my way within reason. I did everything and anything I could work-wise, mainly to bring in money, but also because I thought that work might lead to something else. It was a real mishmash of work. It was a lot of guesswork, particularly around pricing. And I've continued to pick up really odd jobs over the years, and there have been some really unlikely ones. Like, I worked at the 2015 Cricket World Cup in New Zealand, and still don't understand cricket after being on that job for like 2 months. And I have a couple of clients from this time that I still do bits of bread and butter graphic design work for. And like, as much as I didn't love being an architect, the whole experience of working with clients, dealing with budgets, interpreting a brief, and working to deadlines was totally invaluable, I think, in terms of me branching out on my own. So the whole freelance journey for me hasn't been all about lettering and calligraphy, but along the way, that was mainly the work that I was doing and sharing on social media. And it was through social media that I got one of my very first commercial jobs with Lululemon, where I did the lettering for this campaign, and in a funny turn of events, actually ended up with my face in the window at the same time. So looking back on this job, I definitely know that I undersold myself. I think when you're starting out and you get approached by a well-known brand, it can be quite exciting, and you're to the point where you'll probably accept anything to do the job. I have done contra deals over the years where I've done work in return for services or products for someone else, and I think there's a time and a place for that. But you do get to a point in life where there's only so many pairs of yoga leggings that you need, and you need to start negotiating in cash terms. My personal work post-Italy was really gestural, it was expressive and experimental. I was having heaps of fun just playing around, and this is still my favourite way of working. If anyone came to my workshop yesterday, you know I like to get a little bit messy and just play with all sorts of different tools. I started making different tools. I was working on different materials and surfaces. The B here at the top is done with a bunch of twigs. The Gothic O is done with water-soluble graphite. The C is done with a piece of cardboard, and the O at the top is done with a handmade ruling pen. So I really enjoyed just kind of seeing what these different tools would do when you put them into practice. And I really love working with ink and paint on paper. Like you get really unexpected results. Mistakes and inconsistencies happen, which can end up being really beautiful. And as much as I love new technology like the iPad Pro, the Apple Pencil and Procreate, I really struggle to get the same effects and enjoyment from using the iPad as I do when I'm hands-on with ink and paper. So during this year, I started doing a few mural projects, and I got the opportunity to have my very first solo exhibition. I themed the exhibition around the concept of enigma, kind of looking at mural and code, and part of it was painting this mural on the wall of the art gallery. And this exhibition was probably the first time that self-doubt and imposter syndrome really hit me. I was kind of cruising along, creating this work that I really loved, thinking that if I loved it, then everyone else would love it. And then I went to an exhibition opening of this photographer who was doing this second big show. And at the opening, people were kind of talking in hushed tones about how his work in the second show wasn't quite as good as the first show. And it kind of hit me that, you know, you can pour your heart and soul into your work, but as soon as you share it, as soon as you put it on social media, as soon as you put it on gallery walls, and even pitching to clients, like you instantly open yourself up for criticism. And I think people overall, they really enjoyed this show. They enjoyed the mural and other artworks and stuff, but I spent most of the exhibition and prep install convinced that the work wasn't good enough, convinced that I wasn't good enough. And so then it didn't become an enjoyable experience really for me. And this is a feeling that's popped up quite regularly over the years. I have found that internationally, people really like my experimental style of work, and I in turn have been really inspired by the modern calligraphy movement in Europe. I got to exhibit these two artworks plus another one in Munich in 2016, and have also been in various international publications as well. I was funded by Creative New Zealand, which is New Zealand's national arts development agency, to go to Munich, and also they funded me to go to Japan last year as well. So like there is interest at a fine arts level in the type of work I've been producing. However, in New Zealand, I have at times found it challenging to find a balance between the work I love to do and think is beautiful and the work that the New Zealand public want to buy or that clients want to commission, because I think aesthetically there's quite a different look between the two. And so part of my journey has been, and still very much is, trying to find a balance between the two of them. But working for yourself generally is it's great. I love the flexibility. I love working from my own studio. I have a variety of clients who've given me all sorts of great jobs over the years. But when your hobby becomes a job, along with it comes admin, and so much admin. And so you're not only a designer or an illustrator or a calligrapher or a letterer, you become head of finance. You're responsible for doing your tax and your GST. I'm not represented by an agency, so I do all my invoicing and quoting and client relations. I become a bit of a project manager. You have to fix things when they break. You spend a lot of time on YouTube trying to Google things, trying to figure out how things work. And you have to market and advertise yourself, which, as I mentioned, for me doesn't come naturally, but you have to produce content that goes on social media, and you have to manage your websites, and you have to try and get people to employ you or buy your stuff. And then you have to do all the interny jobs, picking up materials and supplies and packaging parcels and going to the post office, and you have to clean your studio, and the list goes on. And I think these are all jobs that I took for granted when I worked for someone else, and when I was working in an office. And there are days, sometimes weeks, where I won't be working on client work, but I will kind of be smashing through the admin, all those behind the scenes tasks that keep my little business ticking along. But if someone asks me what I'm up to, I really struggle to have an answer, because you're like, well, you kind of spent a few hours on YouTube trying to figure out this, or your printer jammed and you're trying to figure that out, or, so it's never, I find with people, particularly people who aren't creative and particularly people who work in an office, they're kind of really unaware of all the behind the scenes work that goes on in small business. And other things will happen, like you'll have really difficult clients. Your printer will break down at the worst moment. Clients will pull out of jobs. People will criticize your work. People won't want to pay you what you're worth. You'll suffer from imposter syndrome. And you'll take on more work than one person can handle. And so then you might just burn out, which, after following this massive yes year of working on anything and everything, and working all the time, I completely burnt out. And then I got really sick. So I battled crazy fatigue, worse than the tiredness of being a first-time parent. I was in pain. My mental health went right downhill really fast. And it took a year, but doctors kind of finally figured out that I had this rare joint disease in my left knee that caused benign tumours to grow. And like, hardly anyone's got this thing. So it's like, why did I get it? Getting sick and being self-employed was basically a disaster. Financially, that year and a half for me was terrible. I didn't have health insurance. I do now. And so if you're too unwell to do the work and there is no one to pick up the slack, if you're too unwell to do the work and you're self-employed, there's no one to pick up the slack, basically. So I'd major surgery, got rid of the stuff on my left knee, 2 thumbs up here, but was feeling very average. And my health now is pretty good. But everything really slowed right down for me after this. I spent a couple of months recovering at home in New Zealand, and then I went to Atlanta. So my partner was over there working on a film, and we'd spent a little bit of time going back and forth between the states. And I was on a work visa, so I was on a tourist visa, so I couldn't work per se, but I got to kind of hang out. I got to enjoy Atlanta, which I didn't know that much about as a city, and it's actually a really cool place. And I was able to recover. We did a little bit of travelling, and I kind of started tinkering away on some side projects that I'd had that had been shelved, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. I also got totally hooked on the TV show Nashville while I was lying in bed with my leg up. Discovered I was a closet country music fan. So we obviously had to do a road trip to Nashville. I also started to learn how to play the guitar. I don't know if I thought becoming like a country music star would be my next calling, but it was also a hobby which for the first time in a long time wasn't work related. And during this time, I'd watched friends and other artists and colleagues kind of flying ahead in their careers and ticking off all these career and life goals. And at times I felt like I don't think failure is quite the right word, but I felt like I was quickly falling behind, that I wasn't meeting expectations, that I wasn't doing as well in my career as I should be. Not that anyone was actually placing expectations on me except for myself. I have discovered over the years I can be very, very hard on myself. I had a lot of time to reflect on where I was, and I came to realise this and continue to remind myself of this famous quote by Teddy Roosevelt, that comparison is the thief of joy. So the worst time to compare yourself to anyone is when you're burnt out or lacking in confidence. And I think it's just so much more important to take time to look after yourself, because if you're sick, none of this is worth it if you're unhealthy. And if you are feeling burnt out or lacking in confidence, get off the gram for a bit, because getting stuck in that endless scroll can be so counterproductive if you're having a bad day. And I never really realised just how curated Instagram was until I became a parent. If anyone has seen those pictures of the mums and the babies and they're all perfectly dressed, it's just so far from reality. It's ridiculous. So through this whole experience of getting overloaded, burning out, getting sick, recovering, and then having another shift in perspective, I learnt the value of saying no. And so this isn't to say that you shouldn't say yes, because saying yes is super beneficial when you're starting out. There's certain opportunities that crop up that you should say yes to, like speaking at Typism when you have a 7-month-old baby. But there are times when saying no is doing the best thing by you. I've learnt to be quite selective about the type of work I take on. and the type of work and the type of clients that I work for. Like, it's really important to me that I only work for people that have similar values to myself, whether that's the client themselves or the product that they're selling. And it's really important that I work with people who kind of value what I do. And I've become much better at standing my ground. So as I mentioned, I'm not represented by anyone. I deal with all job inquiries, all the quoting, all the invoicing, and money stuff can be really hard sometimes. And I feel like there's a lot of guesswork in it. A lot of people don't talk about it openly. And dealing with people can be really hard work sometimes. But if someone gets in touch now with a ridiculous request, like, can you paint a mural on my shop wall for $150, which actually happened a couple of weeks ago, I don't even have to think twice about saying no. I do sometimes have to think twice about sending them an email telling them they're batshit crazy, but I'm trying to work on that. So I think it's really important not to undervalue yourself. I feel all of us have probably done it at some stage, but I think if we all try and know our worth, then it benefits the design community as a whole, if we're all sort of supporting each other and promoting each other. So while I was recovering from surgery, I also had a lot of time to think about what was and wasn't working for me in my work process. My work covers a really, really broad spectrum, and I sometimes feel really conflicted by this. I felt like I was bouncing around between formal calligraphy, abstract calligraphy, hand lettering, graphic design, illustration, and I eventually decided to split myself in two. And I created Scribble Me This with the idea that it would focus on custom hand lettering for branding and advertising campaigns. And I also started running hand lettering and calligraphy workshops through this. There's a certain style and type of client work that this caters for, I think. I've been doing a lot of branding work. At the time, I actually really enjoy branding work, but I wasn't showing it on my website. I wasn't showing it on social media. And I think a lot of clients didn't realize that that's what I was doing. I wanted to highlight this work, but I've always battled with the different sides to my work and what at times to me can feel like a real mishmash of styles. I feel like the clean branding, lettering work, which often ends up being vectorized, is quite different aesthetically to my gestural and loose calligraphic artwork. So sometimes I feel like there's two versions of me. And I really admire people who have found their thing, and you can tell it's their work by looking at it. But at the same time, I think being a jack of all trades has been quite beneficial for me when it comes to client work, particularly in New Zealand where it is a much smaller community. And starting Scribble Me This also allowed me to kind of work under Kate Hursthouse more as an artist. Like I had a bit more freedom. I was started being a lot more experimental. I started using a lot more colour. I worked with more illustrations and patterns and did some art installations. Oh, that's quite loud. Sorry. So this installation was done for Splore Festival. It's this wonderful 3-day arts and music festival which happens in New Zealand each summer in this beautiful regional park next to the ocean. If you ever come to New Zealand, you should tie it in around that so we can all be there together. I wanted to incorporate my mark making and calligraphy to create a story on the fabric panels. It included messages, some were legible, some were more abstract, but they were tied up in these trees. People were able to walk through it, and it was right by main stage, so people could sit under it for a little bit of shade. And last year, my first illustrated children's book became a reality. This started as a personal side project. So I was just illustrating the collective nouns of animals for fun. And when I worked on it on and off over the years, whenever I had a lull in client work, but it wasn't until I was recovering from my knee surgery in Atlanta that I actually had time to try and make this into a book. So side projects and personal work, I think are just so important to have mainly because of the creative freedom you have over them. Like you can kind of just do whatever you want with side projects. This book took 4 years to make. So with side projects, often good things take time because you are often doing them, on the side with client work in between. There is lettering in this book from the very beginning that I look at now and I'm like, oh, and I see a lot of room for improvement. But it kind of, once it got turned into a book, like that's it, it's done. So it's not perfect. I'm sure I'll look at it again in another few years and I'll be like, oh God. But, kids love it, and kids are honestly the best critics to have, I think. And we also had this super fun book launch where we had like real llamas and lizards and all sorts of other creatures at the event, so it was super fun. So basically for 4 years freelancing, I was all about work and travel. I did whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. I could work for hours on end, totally focused and uninterrupted, until last December when this guy arrived. So this is Arlo, otherwise known as the Squidge. And this kid has been 90% and possibly at times 99% of my life for the last 7.5 months. And he's the very reason my perspective has shifted again, and I'm questioning everything about my work, who I work with, and what I want to do. This is my daily life, all of the feels. We had to get him a passport photo to come over here, so it took a little while. But he's the best little dude. He, as some of you probably already met him today or heard him, he is around. He'll probably be around later. So I always feel like I've worn many hats as a sole trader. Like I was an architect, then I went to graphic design, then I kind of went into illustration, art, calligraphy, lettering, a muralist, a teacher, plus all the admin roles I talked about before, and now mum, which is definitely the biggest hat of all. And so I always struggle to answer the question, what do you do? People always ask it, and I feel like there is never one straight answer. And particularly if you're dealing with someone who's not creative, I'm just kind of like, I draw stuff for a living. And until recently, the answer was always work-related, and now I'm trying to figure out what that actually means. So I've really been questioning who I am as a person, who I am as a designer, as an artist, as a brand. Like, what do I want to be doing? What's next? How do I make this mum life and freelance life work? And in a weird way, I think I don't care as much. I used to always really worry about whether or not I'd get a job, and I think I'd bend my back to meet client demands. But my time now is just so precious. I just don't have time for people who don't value me, who don't value my work, and don't value my time. And because my time is precious, I've spent a little bit of it in the last 7.5 months asking, what are my strengths? Like, what am I actually good at in this completely oversaturated Instagram world of calligraphy and lettering? What should I put my energy into? Like, do I want to do abstract calligraphy versus lettering, commercial illustration versus art, branding versus bread and butter graphic design work? Do I want to do more book illustration? And I've wondered if it still makes sense to be split in two, because it certainly adds to the admin tasks running 2 websites and email accounts. And there's no doubt about it, the whole self-doubt and imposter syndrome has been rearing its ugly head again, because seriously, like, how are you meant to be a mum and run your own business at the same time? So if there are any other freelance mums, or dads for that matter, who want to come and have a chat and share some tips with me afterwards, that would be awesome. So when you work for yourself, you're never guaranteed work. And New Zealand has really good maternity leave. We get pretty much almost 6 months of payments. But I've been very conscious of what is next, because I felt like a freelance is what I want to continue to do. Like, I can't get complacent. I felt like I needed to be proactive. I needed to keep chipping away at Instagram, because it almost feels like if you're not on Instagram, then people kind of think you've fallen off the face of the earth. And I kind of need to start marketing myself again. Actually need to start creating some work again. One of the best things to happen to me is how productive I now am in short slots of time. If you give me 2 free hours, I'm like a freelance ninja. Like, I get shit done. Like, I'm so efficient. One of the not so great things is my current workspace. So for 3 years, I had this amazing studio that was all mine. And just before Arlo was born, I moved my studio back home, and I now share a very condensed space with laundry and baby stuff and washing, and it's just not that conducive to working creatively right now. So I just want to talk a little bit more about side projects, because I think they're really important as creatives. And just to emphasize how important they are, I'm just jumping back to this kia ora illustration from the beginning. So kia ora, as I said, it means hello or greetings in Te Reo Māori, which is the native language of New Zealand. I did this illustration in 2015, and so after moving back to New Zealand from Australia, I came to realise how much Te Reo Māori is used in everyday life in New Zealand, and I'd really missed it. And I think any of you Kiwis will know there's something about it that makes you feel like you've come home, because it is just so uniquely New Zealand. This was a personal project. I just did it for fun. I started selling prints and cards. Many a Kiwi expat has one in places like London and Singapore. And that's all it was until the beginning of this year. So 4 years after I did the original illustration, I got an email from an agency who were working with Tourism New Zealand. and they wanted to recreate this illustration for a campaign. Funnily enough, they got my out of office on maternity leave email, but they actually called me because they really wanted to work with me. And I thought, one, this sounds like a great job. Two, these guys obviously want to work with me, which is something, you know, as a designer, you're like, that's pretty special. And also from the beginning, this particular agency were just so understanding of the fact that I was a new mum. Like they 100% worked to my timeline. They didn't have any crazy demands. They were just like, you do you, you know, and you get it to us in your own time. So they've really set the bar for the type of client that I will work with. Unfortunately, the campaign is yet to be released, so I can't actually share the final illustration with you. But I think this is a great example of why you should create the work that you want to be paid for, why you should do the side projects, and just keep at it because you never know what's going to pop up around the corner or like 4 years from now. So we're coming to the end. I feel like doing this talk was a little bit like doing therapy. Like I got a bit personal in there. So I feel like hopefully you'll know me a little bit better. I think it's really important in life in general, but especially in creative careers, that you kind of just learn to embrace the ebbs and flows. In the beginning, in the really early days of freelance, I found the lulls really disconcerting. Like I was always really anxious about what was going to be next. But I quickly came to realize that something always comes up. And the best thing you can do is use the lulls to like get some of that dreaded admin done, work on side projects, you know, and kind of really be productive with them. And I feel that by doing that, you know, and just chipping away at your business on the side and working really hard at it, like things will happen. Like it might not happen overnight, but if you keep working at it and you keep chipping away at it, like things will eventually start happening for you. And I think life is really fluid, you know, and we all grow and change at different rates, and people do things at different rates. And our values change as well as we grow. And so I think sometimes if you pinhole yourself in one particular area or one particular style, you can sometimes get a bit stuck. And I just don't want anyone to feel like they are stuck in any path, in any style. So be open to changing, try new things that kind of push you out of your comfort zone, because by trying something new, it might kind of push you down an entirely different direction creatively. You know, you want to keep evolving, I think, as creative souls. Like it's really important for us, and you want your perspective to keep changing. So, ngā mihi a kia tātou, which means gratitude, and like so much gratitude to you guys for having me here. Regards to you all. Thank you for listening to my story. I really hope you enjoy the rest of today. I'm so excited to hear the other speakers. And let's connect, like find me on Instagram, send me an email, find me later. Let's have a chat. And just thank you, Dominique, and everyone else.